Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations, one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. In this interview, we will compare the first and second Trump administrations in terms of US foreign policy, diplomacy, and international relations. I'm particularly interested in highlighting specific details that can help us better analyze and understand US foreign policy. To explore this, I invited one of the leading US experts on foreign policy, Dr. Hussein Banai, but everyone calls him Hus. So Hus, hello.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation and very much looking forward to the conversation.
Hus is an Associate Professor of International Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is also a research affiliate at the Center for International Studies at MIT. His research interests lie at the intersection of political thought and international relations, with a specific focus on topics in democratic theory, non-Western liberal thought, diplomatic history and theory, US-Iran relations, and others. He has published numerous books and articles on these topics in many academic journals, and Hus is also the co-editor of International Studies Review, which is the flagship journal of International Studies Association. So that's a short introduction to Hus, but I will include more details in the YouTube description so you can browse his profile. Let's start with the first basic and elementary question, and that how would you characterize the core strategic doctrines or lines of Trump's first administration? And maybe there are 3-4 main streams of the policy, main thoughts. And do we see continuity in the second term, or we see slightly a different direction, maybe change of the course?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we first have to note about the Trump administration in general and Trump himself is that it was a very unforeseen event in not only national politics in the United States, but also global politics. This was someone who campaigned on a whole bunch of unorthodox policy positions. And so coming into office in 2016 in a surprise win that really surprised himself as much as anyone else as well over Hillary Clinton, the attitudes that really accompanied his first term, I think were an admixture of a person who was aware of him contesting a very long set of traditional beliefs in American domestic and foreign policy, as well as someone who was beginning to develop his own ideas about how he wanted to take events. I mentioned that by way of preface because with the benefit of hindsight, we now can see that the first term was really best characterized as a period of disruption. He was a disruptive figure who questioned alliances openly, especially the NATO alliance with the European countries. Someone who questioned American spending on all manner of foreign and domestic causes, American largesse, American hegemony, in other words. And someone who really signaled hard that he wanted to pivot away from America's role as a guardian of international order and become someone who made America rich and great again in his own terms, but really using those monikers as a screen, if you will, for his own personal, much more narrow interests that now in the second term we see become a lot more concrete. So if the first term was about disruption around a range of foreign policy portfolios, the second term, I see it as more of a consolidation attitude of that disruption. I think during the first term, just at a level of application and implementation of those ideas, Trump and those who were especially in his inner circle, not even his cabinet, but family members, a couple of advisors like Stephen Miller, really struggled to create a coherent, unified administration, an administrative group who would be able to go and implement these things. And they kept getting undermined by traditional Republicans that he had put in his cabinet. That's why there was so much turnover going over through, 3 secretaries of state, 3 secretaries of defense, God knows how many chiefs of staff in the White House, et cetera. He was not getting the team that he wanted. In the second term, it's very clear that he now has a much more coherent group of people who have signed on to the agenda, who have signed on to his not only version of the world, but his, if you will, contrived version of himself and the world, as someone who has been wronged by the system, as someone who is fighting for your average American's interest against multinational companies and China, et cetera. And I say contrived, I'll come back to that in a second, because it is not, a lot of these beliefs are not factual, but there is a kind of discipline that has been enforced, and now he has that group around him. So in the second term, I think you see a much more cohesive group of people. No one has, been let go of their positions, even if they've erred. Like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was discussing national security matters on the Signal chat. That's these things usually means the end of someone's portfolio, but because they're loyalists, they have gotten to stay. So first term disruption, second term consolidation of disruption, if you want to, in grand strategic terms, thinking about it. And China, I think, has been the one country that has been a kind of a constant target for Trump in the first and second administration. But even there, the approach to China really fundamentally changes from the first to the second administration, I believe.
How do you see the level of confidence? We speak about Trump as a person who is able to change some world or global processes just using a tweet or having an announcement or maybe some innovation in the policy just without any consultations. And that level of confidence, what I can afford, how my decision is going to be accepted worldwide, is very important when you're forming the foreign policy. So what's your perception of that? Maybe based on your research and dealing with sensitive topics and really tough topics in US foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a unique feature of his personality that he doesn't lack in confidence. He doesn't especially lack in the kinds of scruples that you see world leaders usually taking on. He speaks from the gut, oftentimes tweets at late hours in the morning without consultation with many people. I think a standard feature, and this is a feature and not a bug, as the saying goes, of the Trump administration, is that gut reactions, not running things through process, in fact, setting aside process altogether, the deliberative process between cabinet members or committees or anything like that, as a way of broadcasting foreign policy positions is something that they just don't adhere to. And he himself is notorious for not caring about briefing books, for not wanting to be in meetings. He broadcasts his attitudes and feelings, and then all the subordinates have to go and look for a kind of process that matches that after the fact. That's a reverse of how US foreign policy making has traditionally worked in both Democratic and Republican administrations, which is that usually Democratic leaning or Republican leaning think tanks will draft policies, and then those policies will go through, the principals, and then the principals write memos, and then they have meetings in the Situation Room, and then, policy emerges. This is the reverse. The leader communicates attitudes, and then people have to go and fit the right shoe that fits. And so I think that has been a signature of Trump as a personality. That's why I think a lot of political scientists have moved on from discussing his administration as a government, but rather as a regime, because it is far more important to have a person at the top of a regime's attitudes and feelings be communicated than a policy and clinical policy for the country as a whole.
I remember those presidential debates like Obama, Bush, Clinton. And I remember how Republicans and Democrats they had a tough political fight, but there were some norms, some sort of political culture. Do you see nowadays debates between Republicans and Democrats at the same level, or is this all slightly going down the hill? And also, what's the role of the political think tanks? In the United States, this is a very big segment where academics, scholars, experts are all gathered together. And we see some sort of disruptions in this segment. It's like not working very well. Something is going on, but perhaps from the European perspective, we don't know how to name it.
Yeah, very good question. I think on the question of norms, it's very clear that the norms of discourse that governed American two-party system before Trump, since Trump, have completely been thrown out. And both political parties have struggled to recalibrate and to proceed along previous lines. The Democratic Party, especially, is having a hard time right now. But don't forget, it started with the Republican Party. I think the most consequential moment, political moment in American politics really occurred during the first Republican primary debates in 2016, when Donald Trump went on Fox News and started hurling invectives at every single Republican official on stage, going after the Bush family, going after Jeb Bush, who was seen as the kind of the front runner in that race. And within a span of an hour and a half, 2 hours, completely dismantled the terms of discourse within the Republican Party. And the Republican Party completely collapsed and didn't recover during that campaign period. And in fact, over time began to imitate Trump's style of discourse. That discourse has now been with us since 2016, so almost going up to a decade, and had appended not just democratic politics, small d democratic politics in the United States, but throughout the West. We've seen this being copied and imitated by all manner of far right and center right governments, even in Europe, in Latin America, in East Asia, even. And that change in norm of discourse, I think, has really been underemphasized in especially its effect on global politics. And I think we see this to this day. When leaders come and visit Trump in the Oval Office, there's a nervousness of exactly what kind of language and vocabulary they would have to confront. They're not used to sitting across someone who all of a sudden will call them someone who is defrauding the United States or mooching off of American power, or not doing enough to counter rather white genocide in South Africa, as we saw with the South African president in the Oval Office, for instance. So I think the shock of just his very differential approach to discourse is something that is still very much with us, and world leaders are still struggling to respond to. But it has changed politics in very important ways. I mean, now you have leaders tweeting with abandon in many countries that are not even in the grips of far-right nationalist movements. I think leaders have become a lot more informal in their approach to diplomacy. And the public really has not really have to make an adjustment. They've kind of taken it on as high-profile people speaking their mind. So that's an interesting, notable change.
And I can confirm that, because I also noticed that in the past, the most common sentence was like, "What's your argument? Tell me your argument." And nowadays, people are using the words I can't say here because this channel would be deleted. So I think
Right.
this also reflects some sort of movement of the political culture in the United States. The next question is slightly sensitive, but it doesn't mean I want to touch anyone in the United States, and that's, to what extent was America first in the first term as a coherent policy, and how it is now? And the follow-up question, how you as an American, how do you receive that America first? Because from the European perspective, that reminds us those times when someone wanted to be supreme here in Europe, and then there was a war, and we don't have good memories on that. So perhaps you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. I think America First in the first administration, in the first term, was not as coherent to foreign policy. It was very clear that it was geared toward China first and foremost, and perhaps a kind of if you will, shade thrown at European powers for not putting enough money into NATO alliance. So, broadcasting that the United States was not going to be paying predominantly for the defense of Europe, that other peoples had to kind of pay their fair share, according to Trump, but also taking on China's rise head on and, putting severe controls on Chinese industries was something that you could say formed the core of America First in the first term. But it was really a projection of attitudes of, making America great again. America, I'm here to save America. It's all, there's a crisis, etc. But it's very clear that by the end of the first term and during the Biden administration, which I kind of see as an informal kind of second Trump administration, because Donald Trump did not go away from the headlines. He was dominating the news every day. In fact, driving it probably far more than Joe Biden was, constantly countering everything the Biden administration was doing with his Truth Social posts and, also on the stump. I mean, he was campaigning. He was going from town to town to town and having these rallies with the disaffected, etc. So what we saw develop from the end of the first term through the Biden years to the second term is now the emergence of not just an attitude about America First, but a concrete set of policies that are meant to make the world hierarchical again. If the United States played a role since the end of the Second World War of basically setting in place an order, a liberal international order that we hear a lot about in the IR world, and to really be a benevolent hegemon that made sure peace and prosperity was shared. And yes, it wasn't shared equally, but still it was, about complex interdependence and countries' economies and militaries being as coordinated as possible, especially in the West. The Trump administration has taken a hatchet to that and wants to make the world hierarchical again. This is not about shared prosperity. It's about the prosperity of the United States. This is not about the military alliances. It's about military supremacy of the United States. And we saw that reflected in the defense budget that Trump has now taken over to almost $1 trillion of the annual budget, which is an astounding number, jumping from like about $750 billion to nearly $1 trillion in defense spending. But also boosting a particular set of companies in the high-tech sector, especially the CEOs that he invited to his second inaugural, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, the CEO of Microsoft and Apple, all on stage over there to kind of broadcast that we are going to be a technological power and a supreme power, and America First means that the loyalty of these companies to the Trump regime are going to be prioritized over anyone who wants to kind of just carry on trade and commercial relations as before. So America First, I think in the first term was attitudinal. In the second term, we see it now a program being implemented, that parts of which, of course, the tariffs are absolutely legion. The tariffs obviously are, waxing and waning and seem to have been more of a posturing tool than anything else, but they've disrupted the global economy successfully and have enriched those close to this regime in the United States tremendously. Billions of dollars were made in the stock market up and down during the week of those tariffs being unveiled and then taken back. At a personal level, when you ask the question about what America first means, I think it's very clear that in the domestic context, I think the European read on this is very accurate, is that it does harken back to a period of um, not only a hierarchical world between great powers, but a period of hierarchy within domestic societies of white majorities, especially, doubling down on the instruments of power they control domestically. I think it's a nod to the kind of 1920s and 30s era of we are not a multiracial democracy necessarily. We are a society that has had a certain segment of the population in charge, and we'd like to restore that. I think making America great again. Everyone read right through what that meant. A kind of a segregated America that had a particular cohort of people in charge. And Trump has been very clear. His supporters have been very clear. If you look at the immigration policy of the United States, it's very clear right now that restoration of that particular class of individuals to the top of the hierarchy and food chain is something that he clearly has in mind.
And do you think that Trump and his people, they use America first intentionally, or do you think just saying that people accept much more easier because it's short, it's powerful, and it shows some dynamics in a geopolitical sphere? Because we know English language, it has many words. You can say America, a great leader again, or great leadership of America, or the future prosperity of America. So there are so many words you can use, but despite that, he used that America first. So some countries might even think, well, what's the point of dealing with America? We always gonna be second or third or some sort of in order.
Yeah. I think there is a mixture of both, perhaps. I think there are people in the administration who think that this is a kind of a nice, catchy phrase and didn't understand, frankly, the historical connotations of that. There were plenty of people who embarrassed themselves on cable news televisions here, not really understanding the history behind that term. And then there are people who know exactly what they're doing and what this kind of the nod is to a particular group of people. And I think this has been, again, a feature of the Trump administration, right? There is a kind of a showmanship aspect to his, I hesitate to call it governance style, but to his exertion of himself, is that he likes the shock and awe. He likes people kind of, shrieking in horror and worrying about where things might go. But there's also a trolling aspect to his style, which is to kind of, not really mean it, but say it just to make people uncomfortable. And so, I'm tired of playing this guessing game, frankly, because for the last 8 years, a lot of pundits have tried to figure out, what is the essence really here? Why does he? And it's hard to pin down because I think he doesn't care. There's no, it's depending on what the mood strikes on a given day or who he spoke to an hour before. He uses these terms in a way to kind of really go at his opponents.
Hus, what I'd like to mention in the next question is National Security Council. And we know that there is a National Security Act of 1947. And from that year, the Security Council is supposed to guide and guard foreign policy of the United States. There is a Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Energy, and Secretary of Treasury. They're all sitting there in the room, and they are supposed to comment, maybe critically review the foreign policy. So we as scholars, we consider this as maybe safeguard mechanism of the US foreign policy. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see this functioning during the first and the second administration?
Very good question. So in the first administration, there was a lot more continuity with the NSC. There were staffers that were there. The cabinet members that you mentioned were regularly meeting. Trump didn't like what was coming out of the NSC. He would oftentimes ignore or go against their advice, but also didn't attend as many NSC meetings as the president usually does. I mean, that was reported a lot in the first term. But the process more or less resembled what you would see. It's just that the president ignored it. So it existed, but it didn't. Its impact had been completely mutilated. In the second term, what we see is that there is a deliberate program to reconstruct the NSC, fill up those positions of staffers, especially with people who are not only aligned with Trump's sense of things, but whose job is really to go after entities, countries, interests that are contradictory to that of Donald Trump's sensibilities, not to kind of produce very clinical, stale, policy memos based on America's national interest. It's the interest of the Trump regime that they're meant to protect. And so that qualitative shift from the national interest to regime interest is absolutely key and reflected in the NSC makeup. Most, I think, incredible example of this is the recent firing of his national security advisor and his two deputies on the NSC who were seen as kind of still a little towing this is Mike Waltz, who was also in that Signal chat gate scandal implicated in it. They were seen as still a little too close to the traditional Republican way of conducting NSC processes. That was still not good enough for Donald Trump. So they got replaced, and they got replaced with ideological loyalists that the Heritage Foundation and other think tanks recommended. And here, this reminds me of, you asked me a question about the think tank role of think tanks that I didn't answer. So let me bring that up, because that gets reflected in the policy process here nicely. Think tanks traditionally played a advisory, but also a kind of a personnel filling role for both parties when they were in power. So when the Democrats were in power, Democratic leaning think tanks like the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic International Studies would help fill the administration. And a lot of these kind of experts were project leaders at these think tanks, and then they would go on become members of the NSC or in the State Department, Defense Department, whatever their interests were, right? Again, another big change that happens with the Trump administration from the first to the second is in the first term, we saw some of that happen, some of that movement from traditional think tanks, but immediately met by disaffection in that they were still doing the things that think tankers did. So they had to be replaced by political appointees that the president thought were good on camera, communicated effectively his message, etc. And in the second term now, we see that even that has been kind of set aside. And there are maybe the most powerful think tank that's helping the administration is obviously the Heritage Foundation, which drafted the Project 2025 document during the campaign that really gave us the blueprint of what implementing America First would look like. And it's very clear that on immigration policy, on trade policy, on bilateral relations with China and Iran, the Heritage line is being followed very closely. But the Heritage Foundation, is important to note, underwent a Trumpian revolution before Trump came back to power in the second term again. So this is not a traditional think tank White House relationship. The think tank was captured before the coming to power of the second Trump term, which has happened with a lot of Republican-leaning institutions. So I would say that think tanks have lost their place of prominence in the policymaking process, especially at competent technical level expertise, and now become kind of political and if they demonstrate service in the case of the Trump administration to the regime, then they would be incorporated.
How do you see people around Trump who are shaping US foreign policy. When you compare the first and second administrations, do you see any, because you already said it's consolidation, but do you also see a better quality of selection of those people around Trump? And perhaps you might tell us like who is more or less influential behind the scenes.
Well, the palace intrigue of the Trump White House is real, and it's also difficult to glean because people who have important titles do not necessarily have the kind of similar impact that their title suggests with him. It's very clear that in this second term, loyalty is prized above all. So people who stuck with him after he lost the last election and after January 6th, especially, and after he was for a very short period a pariah in even Republican Party, but came back with vengeance. If the people who stuck with him in that dark period is the one that he has especially surrounded himself with, and the people that he trusts more than anyone else. So Stephen Miller, who's a deputy chief of staff in the current White House, but is very clear that he has more power than the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, but also is a senior advisor and an advisor that's always around Trump. On immigration, on trade, he has been at Trump's side, but also on the airwaves, doubling down and communicating what the president says. His family, his sons especially, are also very close to him. It's very clear that some of the appointments that he made to the cabinet were on the advice of Don Jr., his eldest son, who recommended television personalities for important roles, podcasters. So Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, Director of the FBI Kash Patel, and the Deputy Director of the FBI Don Bongino, who's a Fox News personality, were on the recommendation of Don Jr. based on reporting. But also, this is an administration that has hired more media personalities and media savvy people in senior roles than any in history, in American history, but even in the history of the Trump 2 terms. I think something like 60% of Fox News TV personalities now hold administration jobs. And so the emphasis put on a media savvy, loyalty, a kind of a pugilist, ready to go to the mat for the leader. Character traits are the ones that he has really prized above all. And it's very clear that when it comes to foreign policy, this is especially reflected in those portfolios that he's appointed loyalists to. So Marco Rubio at State, Pete Hegseth at Defense, and then the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has taken a very outsized role in foreign policy. His famous or infamous speech, I should say, at the Munich Security Conference, lecturing European countries about his worries about their domestic, birth rates and things like that, really goes to the heart of an ideological level of fascination with prodding foreign nations is really, I think, demonstrative of that kind of personnel shift.
So that also means that it's much harder to research US foreign policy because there are diversity of people. And once I had a conversation with one scholar, and we spoke about statesmen coming from the United States. And he told me, look, this reminds me sort of private social media rather than a diplomatic professional outcomes coming from the United States. Because we are used to those professional statesmen and papers coming from the United States. People behind, they usually put some effort. Doesn't mean if we agree or disagree with those statements, but the quality of the discourse was much higher. This is how we see this at the moment.
I think that's very true. That's very true. And I mean, you made a very important point I don't want to pass over, which is about the difficulty of researching this administration. I mean, I really worry about how we're going to look at the Trump administration in years from now, and study it because of the lack of process that we mentioned. There are literally, very few memos written. All communication is taking place on disappearing message apps like Signal. So there's not going to be level of access that we saw with, I've worked in the presidential library archives, and, every single note communicated to Reagan by his team is preserved there. You can go back and see Clinton, same, Obama. I mean, we're just not going to have that many documents, and whatever it gets exchanged with him right now, it's not getting archived, in violation, I should say, of presidential records law that Congress had passed. That they're meant to preserve things. So it is going to be very difficult to be able to study it in the future at a level we have other presidencies.
That's 100%. And if you notice, many statesmen are sort of like, there is a Q&A session with Trump, and he said something 5 minutes ago, then he added something, and then you don't know, like, is this the official statement, or he's thinking about it, or this is going to be implemented? And this video footage is very difficult to find because it was live, let's say, 4 hours ago. And where is it now? How can I have an evidence? Because as academics, we try to base our work on evidence as much as possible. And for me, from the European perspective, that's super difficult to find. For instance, when you go to the European Commission, you have the statesmen and everything, and the website is like huge. But in the United States, it's getting much more difficult because even journalists, they are discussing, like, did he say something today, something important? Instead of looking at the website and having, this is the memo from yesterday, this is a statement from yesterday, nothing like that.
Right.
So that's very difficult.
No, it is. And I think one of the things that I'm more and more using the term personalist regime, is that one of the implications of a personalist regime is that all that you're left with to study and analyze is the character traits and the personality of the person, because they're going to be fickle with facts, to put it mildly, or that there are so many temper tantrums or changes that really don't give you a coherent view of a doctrine or of a philosophy of governance. So you have to look at the personality as the overriding quality impacting things. And if the personality is to always, one up people, or to always troll, or to always, hide your true intentions, then that's the thing that becomes the story that historians are going to write about this administration, is that forget the substance, because that really, there was no coherence to it, but what we have by way of consistency is the character of this person, the personality, the impulses. And so I think that's how they'll be mostly studied, because we don't have access to data.
Let's move to the international arena a little bit, and I have some easy questions to answer for you. So let's start with the first one, and that's North Korea. And it's very simple. Can we expect the meeting 2-0 between Trump and North Korean leader?
Sure. Anything's possible with Trump. I never say never. The question is, what crisis is going to bring about that meeting? The first one was very clear that, North Korea was a kind of a top item country, a pariah state that had been in the news, that had been, a country the United States did not have any access to or way of engaging with. And Trump wanted to demonstrate, hey, I'm going to be the person that does something that no one else has done. It was all about these kind of, I want to be remembered for doing things no one else did. I'm the only person who could do this. And so that meeting took place. It turned out to be completely at a substantive level meaningless. Did not get the United States any concessions from North Korea. And things more or less remained the same. And all that basically the world was reassured by was that these two are not going to go at each other. They're both kind of enjoyed the photo op. But the threat of North Korea, the military threat to the Korean Peninsula and peace in the Pacific still remains. My hunch is that portfolio is going to kind of stay dormant because of who the president is here, and someone like Kim is well aware of, I do not want to go down a kind of a dangerous path with this person who might either inadvertently weaken my regime or make demands that I cannot deliver on, etc. So if I had to put a percentage on it, probably the likelihood of no meeting taking place is probably 80%, but there's always that 20% chance of Trump wanting to demonstrate something and making it happen.
The second very intense geopolitical theater is a triangle of Israel, Iran, and the United States. And I know that you are into this topic. Is there something you would like to say about this topic regarding the first and second administration? And the follow-up question is, from our perspective outside of the United States, we see that Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu relationship is slightly shaky in the recent months. Do you have the same opinion, or just the perspective from the outside of the United States?
Yes. Let me answer the second and then go to the first. I think the relationship is shaky. I think it is a lot more transactional than people realized. They thought that these two leaders were aligned ideologically, or at least their support bases were, but we're discovering that actually Trump may have gotten all the uses he wanted out of Netanyahu in the campaign, and now that he's president, he doesn't have to listen to him as much, which is a miscalculation on the part of Netanyahu. But I'll get to that in just a second. But I wanted to just first answer that and get to the first. So I think the Israel, Iran, US triangle you mentioned could very well turn out to be the most consequential foreign policy portfolio for this term that Trump faces. And the reason for that is, in the first term, I think Donald Trump's fascination with Iran had an entirely different reason behind it, which was canceling Barack Obama's signature foreign policy achievement. He didn't even understand or care about the details of the nuclear deal. And all he wanted to do was to kind of deliver on a campaign grievance that he had communicated, which was the Obama administration made a very bad deal with Iran and gave them a whole bunch of money for getting nothing in return, lifting sanctions, etc. So he comes into office, and within a year, he dismantles the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and leaves Iran out in the cold. It reimposes all the sanctions through a policy of maximum pressure, and very much delivers to Benjamin Netanyahu exactly the kind of isolation that Netanyahu wanted Iran to be in. And so he was satisfied with that accomplishment. His accomplishment was to cancel Obama in the first term and put maximum pressure. And then he really wasn't looking for a deal that much with Iran again. He put a bunch of lines that really made it impossible for Iran to agree to. But more importantly, his Secretary of State in that first term, Mike Pompeo, was someone who was ideologically very hardline on Iran and wanted regime change in Iran. So Trump was at odds with both his Secretary of State and, for a brief period, his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who was also a neoconservative. Both of them wanted regime change in Iran, and Trump didn't. They want to go as far as that. So the Iran portfolio kind of sat there, and Trump was not interested in pursuing further in that. But he did take a critical action that really, I think, explains why the Iran portfolio is in a bit of a mud today. And that was to order the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, which is their elite paramilitary unit that was running Iraq and Syria at that point. And Trump assassinated Soleimani in Iraq in January 2020. And that was for the Iranian regime an act of above and beyond terror. He was their kind of most revered general, and they thought the Trump administration is really hell-bent on getting rid of the Islamic Republic. And so that history got bottled up and really made it even that much more difficult for the Biden administration to even get the Iranians to trust the United States again, because they were worried that, well, what if Trump comes back again? We're not going to sign a deal that he's going to rip apart again. So we're not going to do anything. So they just sat there, and the nuclear deal didn't go anywhere. And Benjamin Netanyahu, meanwhile, did everything he could to keep that isolation of Iran in place. And after October 7 attacks by Hamas in 2023, Joe Biden embraces Netanyahu, flies there, and then the United States provides support to Israel. And then we had that kind of very critical, consequential 9 months of back and forth between Israel and Iran and their proxies, or Iran's proxies. And you have this remarkable development just before the Trump administration takes power, where the Israeli military takes out not only the leader of Hamas in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh, in a Revolutionary Guard compound in North Tehran, then kills Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and levels Gaza and Hamas in the Gaza Strip and kills Sinwar. And so Iran all of a sudden finds itself completely devoid of allies, and it's only a matter of months before Bashar al-Assad's regime falls as well, and Iran's influence completely gets pushed out of the region. That background of Iran having lost tremendous geopolitical leverage compared to the first term, combined with the fact that Israel has reinstated deterrence against Iran and its regional allies, is the context in which the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, comes into power. This is their inheritance, everything they could have hoped for. So Trump is no longer interested in giving Netanyahu anything more than he already has. Iran has been pushed out of Syria, has been pushed out of Lebanon. They have their tail between their legs, and their nuclear program is the only thing they have left. And I get to negotiate that, not you, Benjamin Netanyahu, because I want a deal that is a deal I impose that is better than the Obama deal. Now, the problem here is that there's very little you could do to get a deal with the Iranian government that is better than the deal Barack Obama got out of the Iranian government. So right now, where we are in the process is that they're trying to desperately find an angle that makes a deal with Iran look better than what Obama had agreed with Iran in 2015. And so in the middle of all this, I think Netanyahu, who does not want to see a deal because he understands a deal with this president, with Donald Trump, is probably going to stay for a long while, because this is something that he cannot go at. And yet he's frozen out of the policy process as well. So the big question for us is, in the next 6 to, I would say, 12 months, as negotiations are taking place, would Israel attack Iran's nuclear installations to really force Donald Trump's hand or not? I think that's a very risky bet for Netanyahu, but it's a serious possibility. So that's why I think it's the most sensitive geopolitical portfolio, because it's the one that is most likely to result in military conflict compared to the other issues that the Trump administration faces.
I spotted an interesting element in this, and that's the figure of Mr. Witkoff. And he goes to Moscow to speak with Vladimir Putin. He goes to Israel to speak with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he goes everywhere. How do you see that one person is doing completely different agendas? because war in Ukraine and Israel, Iran, that really needs a person who is deeply into to know all those details, cultural differences, and everything. It's so complex, so complicated. And we also discussed this with a few colleagues that we were thinking, is there no other person who is going to be a special sort of envoy for this particular agenda? Or how is it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it goes back to the point about loyalty, about someone that is very close to the family. Steve Witkoff is someone who stuck with Donald Trump through all those kind of dark moments. He was his golf partner at Mar-a-Lago by his side the whole time. And someone who also, his son is very much involved in this kind of dark tech world that supports Donald Trump. And there's all sorts of investments that his family has that are tied up to these policies of the administration. So he's someone that Trump has a lot of stuff on that he could pull on if he proves to be disloyal, and he has every reason to be loyal. The other thing about it is that's very at a level of kind of process that's very important to understand is that a special envoy is not a Senate confirmed position, which means Steve Witkoff never has to appear in front of a congressional committee, hold his hand up, swear on the Bible, and say he's going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if he lies, he gets prosecuted for it. So he's immune from that kind of scrutiny. And
Nice.
the third thing is that he completely circumvents Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, heads of national intelligence, etc., and directly speaks to Trump. So he can, has a direct line in that way. So I think Steve Witkoff's proximity to Trump and his loyalty to him and his interests is something that really makes a difference for Trump this time around. He can deliver a message directly from Donald Trump that might be at odds with what his secretaries, his cabinet members believe to another world leader. And so I think we are, in a situation where it is not entirely surprising that envoys are so much closer to Donald Trump and have his ear than those positions that are Senate confirmed and are subject to congressional scrutiny.
The next question will be slightly complex, and that's the Donald Trump attitude to multilateralism. So we have NATO as a security architecture, we have United Nations as an international diplomacy forum, and many people ask, what's going on with Trump, that he doesn't like to negotiate in that sort of multilateral forums, but he always prefers, as he says, to make a deal with someone. Is this sort of characteristics coming from his nature as a business person, like to make a deal with another company, or this was adopted as a specific trait of the U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question because I think it's an extension of his disregard and open contempt for bureaucratic process and any kind of deliberative process. Donald Trump does not like to be in deliberation mode. He wants to be in decision mode all the time, meaning that, in any given transaction, he likes to call the shots, make the red lines visible, put out the bargaining chips, and then have the other side respond. He does not want to sit down and have 4-hour conversations about, process or, which country's interests, how to satisfy their interests, etc. He is not in just of that mind. And I think here a lot of people have drawn attention to his time as a celebrity television host of The Apprentice in the United States, where he has this kind of he attaches value to people who don't overthink, who act, people who engage in meetings or meander in trying to satisfy so many different disparate interests is just, not how he thinks. That's one element at the level of, again, process and formality. I think the second most important component of his approach really stems from the fact that he is someone who has deep distrust for the kind of accountability measures that the liberal order has put in place. He sees them as constraining of not just America's power, but his role as well. He thinks that if certain leaders have to commit certain crimes or acts that go against international law, that's of necessity to their interests, is not necessarily a terrible thing. And that, any international laws or conventions or norms that constrain the powerful, especially going back to the hierarchy point, is something that he deeply distrusts and wants to push back against. So I think it is his style, but it is very much a style that emanates from how he thinks of interest and power in domestic and international settings. His interest first, his power and prestige first, above and beyond that of a country or a state. And we've seen it time and again respect the kinds of world leaders that also behave in that way. I mean, Vladimir Putin obviously has been talked about a great deal as someone that he has always been overtly respectful towards. But also Xi Jinping is someone that he speaks very respectfully of. I mean, he talks about China in negative terms, and especially the United States losing to China. But whenever it comes to the level of leadership, there's almost a level of respect the way he talks about Xi. Kim, similarly, the Iranian leaders, he speaks always very respectfully. The Arab Gulf monarchies, in his visit, we saw how positive he was about how decisive they are and charismatic they are. Those are the qualities that he really values.
There is a slightly under-researched policy or topic, and that's the US foreign policy towards neighbors, Canada, Mexico, and South America. And I think this is something very interesting, because when you speak about respect, and then you will say, oh, just become the 51st state of the United States, that doesn't go with that much respect dimension. So what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, now you're speaking to someone who's a dual national of Canada and the United States, because I'm a Canadian citizen as well. And I think you're absolutely right that it's been understudied, but also for a good reason, because we have been functioning like a 51st state Canada, in that our trade relations, our political relations, our educational, cultural ties were so intertwined with the United States that it was almost like an afterthought that this was another country. And obviously Trump coming in and all of a sudden saying, no, we want to formally make you a 51st state, and insulting the elected leaders of Canada, calling them governor instead of prime minister, that he did with Trudeau, really, I think, awoke a sense of national identity in Canada that I haven't ever experienced since moving there when I was a teenager from Iran. And I think what's interesting here is that the ideas about taking over Canada or even Greenland or the Panama Canal were very prominent in the first month or so of the administration and have since kind of gone to the background. That's probably because at some point beyond him kind of liking the idea and wanting to broadcast it, he was made aware of the resources the United States would have to commit military and financially to make those things happen. And he immediately kind of pulled back, or starts to emphasizing it less. We see this trend over and over again with him. Like, with tariffs, it's most apparent because, the markets reacted the way they did and he panicked and he pulled back. But when you all of a sudden are telling your Secretary of State or Defense, like, how much would it take for us to go and take over Canada? And they say, well, you're going to have to do a ground invasion. You're going to have to do this. You're going to have to, spend this much money. You would say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll stop talking about it less and less and do the trolling thing still, but not really be serious about it. And so I think what we see there is that this division once again between attitudes and material reality, that I also think it's understudied in IR, is that a lot of world leaders, because we haven't had many world leaders like Trump, but there are enough of them in the world still, who communicate certain attitudes. And this could be even positive attitudes, right? But the gap between those attitudes and the reality, material reality of what you can actually afford to do at any given time really dictates where you end up adopting as your position. And I think with Trump, what we're seeing is that he has these very bombastic attitudes, very belligerent, that not only end up falling short, but have material consequences in a sense that Canada is now actively divesting out of this relationship, looking towards Europe. And Canadians are not traveling to the United States. I mean, tourism is down 60%. From Canada. Canadian students are now looking to stay in Canada and no longer come back here. The brain drain that the United States had benefited from in terms of Canadian people like me moving to the United States, working here and teaching here, is now getting reversed. People want to go back home. And so there is material costs now associated with this kind of attitude, even if he doesn't follow through with it. So yeah, these are unique features of, I think, the Trump regime that will probably remain unique if he ever goes away and we restore the status quo ante in terms of governance in the United States, that we'll see being especially unique to him.
And the South America?
And with respect to South America, I think there it's very fascinating that he looks at South America almost exclusively through the lens of immigration. And the whole, again, spectacle of an Oval Office meeting with Bukele, the El Salvadoran president, coming in and basically telling him that thank you so much for becoming a giant prison for our country, and take the people we're deporting, and we're going to send them to you, and we're going to send you even more in the future. I mean, it's a very nakedly insulting and transactional way of saying we only look at South America as a country that could address our immigration issues. With Mexico, it has been a different story altogether, because Mexico has been part of a big trade partnership with Canada and the United States, first in NAFTA and then in the US-Mexico-Canada trade deal that got renegotiated. And there, the president, Sheinbaum, has really held her ground and has pushed back in a way that Trump has actually come to respect. And it's very clear also, because of the trade ties between Mexico and the United States, there's a lot more there than just movement of people. And Mexico has strengthened their kind of immigration policies. I think she very smartly early on committed military troops to the border, which is what he wanted to see, Trump wanted to see. And he was satisfied with the kind of optics of that. But with the rest of the continent, I think he still very much looks at it as something that comes down to immigration policy.
The last question for today's interview has: when we speak with students and some junior scholars, they mostly think of American or the US foreign policy as anchored in realist perspective of IR. Yes, so they are citing those scholars and experts, but with Trump, there is a modification with this thought. And I always say, be very careful when you generalize, when you put everything to one bucket or one category. So for those students and junior researchers, what would be your piece of advice as a senior scholar and professor, how to approach Trump's foreign policy?
That's a very good question, and one that I've run into as well. I think the mistake oftentimes is that whenever there's an exertion of power or interests in world politics, to think that we are in a realist moment, that there is the principles of realism, of hard power politics, balance of power really kick in. And that's true in certain instances. Historically, from the First World War into war period, Second World War, the Cold War, you can see a lot of those principles applying. But I think at any given moment, a range of IR theories actually have equitable explanatory power in world politics. You only have to look at most of what we've talked about in this interview in terms of how much the role of personality, of ideas attached to that personality, of ideology, the role of ideology, the impulses of a cohort of economic interests, much more than national interests, predominate in American foreign policy making today, right? So constructism has explanatory power. Marxist political economy has explanatory power in this regard. Liberal institutionalism still has a lot of explanatory power because even in disarray and disintegration, there's a lot there to explain by way of speed bumps in the way of the Trump administration, or how other countries are banding together to balance the United States, right? Hard power politics also, there are areas that we could point to and say, oh, wow, okay, this action taken against this Chinese entity or this particular military maneuver is clearly trying to communicate a message about balance of power that realists can explain reasonably well. There is offensive realism, defensive realism at play in the Ukraine-Russia situation. In the negotiations between Iran and the United States, you have real material interests at play, but also the kind of personalities and ideological factors that have to be weighed in equally. So my kind of cautionary advice here would be that we live in a very complex world that has a multiplicity of variables constantly crisscrossing each other. You need to draw on a wide toolkit, and it would be a mistake to box in any particular country at any given time in one particular theoretical school. And I think a lot of realists today who are looking at the architecture of world politics in flux are really quite in shock that people are looking at Donald Trump as a kind of a Machiavellian figure, because one thing we've learned very clearly here is that he does not have a clear reading of the interests of the United States. When you look at the tariff policy, you look at who it's hurting, more than any other. It's American entities. So how could you look at it and say this is a projection of American power, right? When you look at what's happening with the policies of the administration when it comes to international student visas, whose interest in this hurting? It's American soft power and the brain drain that the United States has benefited from, that this policy is hurting more than anything else. So how could this be to the benefit of American national interest? But when you look at the narrow interests of the regime, of the personalities at the top of the thing, you can say, oh, wow, okay, this is a different set of variables that realism actually doesn't touch on, because domestic politics is not historically something that realists take an interest in. They usually look at the end of the policy process and what it results in, foreign policy making. I think given those examples and those variables, we have to maintain a pluralist a viewpoint to analyzing world politics, especially with someone like Donald Trump in charge of the United States.
Hus, so let's speak about the European Union now. How Trump is seeing the EU, was the perception of the EU as an institution versus member states. Because we know that Trump tends to be slightly less multilateral than we would like to see.
Yeah, great questions. I want to go back to a kind of a framework with which I answered your question about the Trump administration in the last round of interview we had together, which was if first term as disruption, second term as a consolidation of that kind of disruptive politics. And I think when we look at the US-EU U.S.-European countries' relations in the first term, we do find that is the opening salvo of disrupting the traditional relationship between the United States and the European Union and European countries in general. I would say Trump makes a very clear distinction in his head between the two. You're absolutely right that he has zero respect for multilateral institutions, and he thinks they're kind of, in a way, not where the locus of power is. He immediately understands and intuits that there are more powerful countries, and he wants to immediately go and deal with those. So he had closer contact with the French president, with the UK, Prime Minister of UK, closer contact with Germany. He wanted to directly deal with the leaders of those countries, and he, by all appearances, and a lot of this stuff was caught on video, even his body language was very dismissive of the European Union bureaucrats and leadership, dismissive of their concerns and what have you. Another, at a more substantive level, I think the content of disruption in the first term was almost exclusively centered around NATO funding. And he believed that the Europeans were not paying their fair share. They were piggybacking on American financial support for multilateral institutions. And he wanted for them to pay up. And he also didn't care about the kind of traditional unifying discourses around the NATO alliance. He almost operated constantly signaling that the United States had its own interests vis-a-vis Russia, for instance, or China. There would be not a unified Western response or posture towards those global issues. And that really, I think, disrupted the way European leaders, both at the EU level and individual countries, had to calibrate their relationship with Donald Trump. And in the first term, because it was new, because it was something they had not experienced before, you could see it being very clumsy on both sides. The Europeans kept hoping that, okay, well, maybe the adults in the room around Trump are going to be the ones that we have to really go to. So we'll talk to Rex Tillerson. Oops, he got replaced. Maybe we'll talk to the Secretary of Defense. Oh, oops, he got replaced. And the kind of revolving door of bureaucrats around Trump, I think, was also very dizzying. We should not lose sight of that for a lot of European leaders that found that the biggest impact Donald Trump was having was in the disruption of the consistent policy coordination and processes between Europe and the United States. When all of a sudden your kind of undersecretaries of state or defense no longer were relevant. Even the National Security Council members were not relevant. These were not the kind of contacts that had any sway with Donald Trump. His whims seemed to kind of shift with, what he perceived to be what was benefiting him or the United States on a daily or even hourly basis. So I think the first term was a period of adjustment to this new reality. And on the whole, I think individual European country leaders, especially leaders of France, Germany, the UK, Italy, discovered that they have to kind of chart their own path and forge a personal relationship with him. And I think Emmanuel Macron in France was the one who was very eager early on to kind of separate France and French interests and to directly deal with Donald Trump as a kind of a vanguard of European interests. And then all those others followed suit as well.
When Trump speaks with leaders, the perspective of member states and the European Union, as you pointed out, do you think that Trump is thinking about the EU as a geopolitical power without actually power? Because otherwise, I'm thinking, why to damage or why to put some sort of disruption in something that works? Because the United States and European Union, I mean, it's not without any mistakes or without any concerns, the relationship, but still it works pretty well on both sides of Atlantic. So how do you see this?
That's another very good question. I think it's a puzzle that still very much hangs over the second term. You know, this is a direct quote from Trump. He said the European Union was created exclusively to screw us, and which is, a shocking observation by, I would say, any office holder in the United States, let alone the president of the United States, the most powerful person in charge of charting policy toward the European Union. It's very clear now, to kind of bring it back to the second term, or bring it forward to the second term, that Donald Trump has some kind of base beliefs, be they real or imagined, conspiratorial or pragmatic, about certain institutions and certain powers and personalities in global politics. It's very clear that maybe based on his views in the 1990s, people have gone back and kind of found a lot of, has a lot of paranoia about Europe really congeals in the 1990s, where he believes that this bloc is solidifying, the EU monetary union is getting stronger, and the euro will eventually take over the US dollar. And his paranoia from that period, I think, has really set his thinking about the European Union as a whole, that this is a bloc that is meant to economically overtake the United States eventually. And has not really updated that view or paid much attention to the cooperation between the United States and the EU, how a lot of American multinational corporations are actually working with European multinational corporations. And this is a very complex, interdependent relationship between the United States and European Union. And the success of the United States is just as dependent on the success of Europe. And on top of that, to go back to the previous answer, he has this set view about the security pact between Western Europe and the United States. That's something that is come at the expense of American Treasury, that we pay way more. We're the ones who ultimately have the material power. The Europeans are not. They're kind of paper tigers, et cetera. And so I think when you combine those two material factors, his conception of Europe as a bloc that is detrimental to American interests, it's something that, although there's much evidence to the contrary, he's really held on to, and he's very intent on talking about. Now, I say that because there's a difference between talking about it and actually doing something material about it. So far, even up to this second period of consolidation, we have not seen any serious material steps being taken by the United States under Donald Trump to disentangle the U.S. Business economic ties with the European Union. He has praised some leaders for agreeing to increase their contributions to the NATO budget. Every time he goes to Europe or sits down with European leaders, he brings up kind of these old gripes about the EU trying to take advantage of the United States, but he immediately shifts to underlining the strong relationship between Italy and the United States, but also at the personal level, like Giorgia Meloni and him, Emmanuel Macron and him. He's clearly shifted to that personal relationship mode, and if people like him and they understand how to massage his ego, then he finds them to be favorable. And I think Keir Starmer in the UK, for instance, right now has done a reasonably good job of that. People were worried that after Boris Johnson, someone who very much adopted the Trumpian populist style and discourse, even though in private he clearly didn't think much of the U.S. president, that that was good enough for Trump, and he appreciated that. And people were worried about Labor, kind of a left of center political party, not being able to do that. And Keir Starmer has actually proceeded to really emulate that as well. So, it's as with everything with Trump, the substance is always a few blocks removed from the rhetoric and the discourse. But the rhetoric and discourse does translate into some material anxieties. And I think it would be foolish to think that Donald Trump's repeated battering of European Union and European contributions to their common defense and to the economic relationship between the United States has not given comfort to Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. They very much would like to exploit those fissures between Europe and the United States as much as they can.
I'm glad you mentioned Xi Jinping because the next country is China. And here I'm interested in sort of comparison of China and the United States regarding the strategic competition versus sort of trade or economic leverage. How can you compare this in the first and the second Trump's administration?
Yeah, I think in the first administration, China hawks were especially hardened in the United States. That Donald Trump broke a taboo that had been a kind of a bipartisan taboo of, saying critical things about the Chinese political system, but not really going overboard as painting them as a threat. Both Republican and Democratic administrations previous to Trump held that hope of incorporating China into a global liberal international order somehow by, forcing it to either through commercial ties or through multilateral agreements to play by the rules of international society. Trump comes in and basically says that the Chinese have used this as a way of really doubling down and on their economic investments, of directly competing with us in sensitive sectors, semiconductors, for instance. And we've been taken out to the shed by them. They're taking advantage of us. They're stealing our intellectual property. From small business owners to multinational corporations inside the United States, China is stealing their knowledge and producing things cheaply and marketing it back to us. And so we've been the suckers. And I'm no longer going to go by this. And the taboo of not speaking out loud about these actions of the Chinese Communist Party was broken in the first term. And we saw that in the interregnum between the first and the second term during the Biden administration. In fact, the Biden administration very much kind of held on to the same policies of the first Trump administration vis-a-vis China, that the strategic competition with China had entered a very critical phase where the Chinese are on the verge of overtaking the United States on economic productivity and in real GDP terms. But more importantly, that meant that they're nourishing their defenses and their military to a level where they could not only counter but perhaps actually completely neutralize American influence in the Pacific. And so that kind of alarm, a posture of alarm toward China, is something that followed Trump into the Biden administration. Now, Biden didn't use the same rhetoric, obviously, as Donald Trump did. But he very much doubled down on investment in chip factories inside the United States, the sanctions that were placed on China and Chinese commercial entities remained in place. And the United States especially renewed its commitment to the security of Taiwan and all the rest of it. So I think the taboo breaking of first term, the continuation of Biden, have really set up this current moment where Trump is kind of, because of the variety of other issues that are happening in this period of consolidation inside the United States, the reshaping of the American bureaucracy in the face of the America First MAGA movement, the cleansing of the kind of globalist bureaucrats out of the policy-making process in Washington. That has mostly preoccupied Trump so that he can then, announce a more formal policy toward China. So far in the second term, that is a particular issue that has not become center stage. Donald Trump right now probably doesn't want it to become center stage because it's unclear where he stands on the confrontation with China right now. But he's cleaning up in their mind. This is in their language. A lot of the entanglements that had kept American power weakened or at a disadvantage, I should say, vis-a-vis China. So the pullback from the Middle East, the pullback from investment in other military alliances and support is part of that picture.
Hus, can you please briefly explain the role of Taiwan in Trump's calculation? Because we see some mixed signals coming from Trump, and I think that could be quite a good question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a question how dedicated Donald Trump is to protecting the sovereignty of Taiwan, and to also signal to the Chinese in a manner that they would understand that if they were to suddenly move, encircle the island and overtake it, that he would act decisively militarily. The worry has been compounded by the fact that Trump's response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been one of both sidism and moral equivalency. He's blamed Ukraine as much about the invasion, if not more, for the invasion than Russia. And so observers of U.S.-Taiwan strategic relationship are really worried that if China were to move on Taiwan, Donald Trump, would not do much, and in fact, would use that as a bargaining chip to, gain some other sort of advantage or some crumbs from Beijing. But I think there's equal concern if you're the Chinese government that Donald Trump has proven so unpredictable that you cannot really ascribe to him a fixed view on anything. And that, in fact, if they were to militarily move on Taiwan, it would be seen as so humiliating to him that this happened under his watch that he could actually come down, much harder than a Democratic or another Republican administration would do. So for that reason, I think they've kind of held back and they're kind of trying to see which direction he goes. They're also kind of, I think, keenly observant of domestic politics inside the United States. And they're watching to see whether his power domestically is growing or weakening, whether he's at a stalemate, how other global events, Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war, would impact American military movements and, frankly, their capability to be able to project power in another theater at the same time. But also, and just as importantly, whether there are kind of important ways in which they could manipulate Donald Trump himself into thinking that, China is a partner all of a sudden and no longer a strategic competitor, if they give him enough crumbs, if they, concede on certain issues. So I think the issue of Taiwan hangs in the balance of this kind of overall strategic picture. But if I think the Taiwanese government, you probably do not take comfort from being in this kind of precarious imbalance because of, you're at the whim and appetite of Donald Trump.
Let's move to Russia.
Sure.
Putin and Trump, on one hand, sort of good friends, theoretically. On the other hand, Trump promises regarding to Ukraine, and then he realized, but it's not as easy as I thought. So we are still waiting for those promises regarding to Ukraine. Do you see that Trump is accommodating some strategic interests, or you see it just high politics and business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question in international politics of what is the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? I think in the first term, obviously Trump comes into office under the shadow of possible Russian influence in internal American elections. He's very much burdened by that domestically, seen as someone who, because of his rhetoric on Russia, was someone who could have perhaps even been a Russian agent, as some Democrats to this day still believe, right? There was the famous Mueller inquiry into the Russian influence peddling in American elections. There were all these business ties between, the dodgy Russian businessmen and the Trump campaign. Some of his campaign chairman served time in jail, Paul Manafort, for taking bribes from Russian entities and not reporting it. So there was a lot of kind of concern that, not only was he had close affinity to Vladimir Putin, but he may have actually been, a secret agent of the Kremlin. That obviously picture has moved quite considerably. And we should also note that Donald Trump's second impeachment came because of, in the House of Representatives, because of his open, caught on tape, cajoling of the Ukrainian government to bribe him. And to also come out with damning information about Joe Biden so that the election, would go favorably toward Donald Trump. I mean, this seems now like ancient history, but it wasn't that long ago where he was in this picture. So it's important to remember this. But I think one of the perhaps lines of clarity that has emerged in the Trump-Putin relationship is that it's very clear Donald Trump continues to admire the posture that Vladimir Putin projects as a strong head of a state who has complete control from top to bottom of his country and who acts decisively. That is what we now can tell, now that he's kind of settled into his role in the second term, especially. Donald Trump most admires about Vladimir Putin, and he wants to be that kind of figure for the United States. His issue had been that previous American presidents, look like schoolboys next to Vladimir Putin. They, talked about multilateralism and sat down and took the interest of all the other countries into consideration and wanted to form coalitions against Putin, versus, sitting there, mano a mano going with him, but also really projecting American strength. And what's interesting in the second term is that, he comes into office and people think that, well, here goes Ukraine, right? He's going to hand it over to Vladimir Putin. And initially he starts very much going at Zelensky for making concessions, for being too stubborn and not thinking about the future of his country, that he wants to bring the war to an end. One of his campaign slogans in this last election was that my first day in office, the Russia-Ukraine war will end. There will be peace when I come into office, and you'll see. That didn't happen. And in fact, the Russians kept up their assault on the Ukrainian territory. And I think what he immediately noticed in that period where he was pushing Zelensky, and especially after that infamous Oval Office encounter with half of his kind of cabinet sitting around, and J.D. Vance, his vice president, going at Zelensky, lecturing him, telling him, you're being too stubborn, you're ungrateful, you never say thank you. Other, brutish member of the MAGA coalition from Congress, bluntly asking Zelensky, why don't you, wear a suit in the Oval Office and respect the office, et cetera, et cetera. Total kind of humiliation of Zelensky in front of cameras. I think what he recognized that after all of that, Vladimir Putin kept his pressure and kept bombarding Ukraine. So here he was thinking that I just did this to the person who's supposed to be our, the country we protect. So it's time for you to give concessions. And he was on Truth Social writing to Putin, communicating kind of publicly, which probably you shouldn't do with Vladimir Putin. Um, we did our bit. Now it's time to do your bit. And nothing came from the Russian side. In fact, the intensification of the war took place. And then he started to kind of understand that Putin's game is far bigger than, having a friendly president in the United States, that actually material power really is important to Vladimir Putin. He wants to increase Russia's geostrategic position to consolidate his power over, especially vis-a-vis the European Union. And I think it finally sunk in for Donald Trump that this is a guy who is not just doing what he's doing because he doesn't like the sitting American president, that he's really hard pushing on these core interests. And Donald Trump is increasingly being seen as someone who is weak opposite Putin, that Putin is looking stronger than he is. And I think the shift in discourse over the last 2 months, especially when he's been saying a lot more negative things about Putin on Truth Social, really testifies to the fact that he's looking increasingly effeminate, weak, opposite, Putin, that he doesn't listen to, Putin doesn't listen to him and doesn't take his cues from him. And that's very distressing to his ego and narcissism vis-a-vis Russia.
Absolutely. I think Trump should read some Russian documents coming from Kremlin. For instance, the latest one, or one of the latest ones, is the new Russian Navy strategy. And the investment over there is huge, and the plans, as you said, it's far beyond the just regional game. It's a global aspiration.
Exactly.
So, let's quickly speak about the sanctions. I have a statistics here. It says that there are 6,433 U.S. sanctions on Russia out of 21,692 sanctions on Russia globally. And we speak about the, let's say, normalization, which is a modern term for balancing the relationship between the countries. Is it realistically possible to lift those sanctions in a short term? Because some people, they expect Trump to lift some sanctions to allow the US businesses come back to Russia, especially when we speak about the Arctic, we speak about the natural resources, and there are some activities already in Moscow regarding the US chamber. So how do you see those sanctions? Because for me, it sounds impossible to lift them within a short period of time, because just the paperwork is massive.
Yeah, I think your instinct's right about that. I think it is a very huge undertaking. I mean, you have to look at sanctions on Russia, which is the most sanctions country in the world, we should say, as akin to Lilliputians who have, brought down Gulliver and kind of held it to the ground. And, this is a giant. It could, it has broken free of some of these sanctions. That a lot of them are immaterial, we should say, that they have gone around them very easily. And, they forged other strategic partnerships with, China, Iran, for instance, especially around the issues of, access and sale of oil and gas, which is hugely materially important to Russia. Taking them off is not, you're absolutely right, a very simple stroke of pen, and you can just, lift all of these things. The Treasury sanctions alone by the United States require a great deal of kind of cross-checking with multiple American industries who have moved into particular spaces where they may lose advantage. Now because the sanctions have been on Russia for such a long time, you've created a constituency that's invested in keeping them in place because they've cornered that market. So now you're going to kind of take the advantage away from American businesses who have kind of filled the vacuum because now Russian firms are going to enter into those areas or resume their operations. And again, because these sanctions have been in place for a very long time, some of the entities that did business in Russia, from banks and financial institutions like, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, to energy firms, they've moved their operations completely out of Russia and rebuilt it elsewhere because it's too uncertain. And so even if you lifted the sanctions, the uncertainty is too great still that it might get snapped back for some other reason. So they're not going to immediately, want to go back. And so the purpose then is like, should we, get rid of the sanction or just keep it in place since it's, nominal anyway. The sanctions world is so convoluted. It is so labyrinthine, baroque, that, especially in the case of Russia, that I think it's reached a place where it is rhetorically easier to speak of increase or decreasing sanctions than it is logistically possible to implement or disimplement those sanctions. And Trump is in a bind right now because there is a great deal of lobbying going on for keeping certain sanctions that benefit some of the companies around the MAGA base in place. Yet at the same time, he wants to, make gestures toward Putin, especially if, something material is going to come out of the conflict with Ukraine. But I think because of the stalemate in the Russia-Ukraine war, the sanctions regime is also going to remain in this kind of stalemated place. And, with other conflicts going on, I know we're going to talk about the Middle East conflict, but that is a big sticking point for this administration to kind of wait and see how everything else kind of plays out to then, perhaps move and adjust it. But it is a gargantuan task to dismantle the sanctions, to also coordinate with the European Union to do the same for some of these things to actually have legs, and then to address American business interests vis-a-vis Russian business interests.
I just want to add that in the past, the American businesses usually dealt with old names like Igor Sechin, Abramovich, and all those people. But nowadays, there is the second generation of business people in Russia, and the majority of them, they were educated in the West. Harvard,
right.
London School of Economics, and all those prestigious institutions. So I think they are calculating if Americans left and they want to come back, that wouldn't be cheap.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That's my remark. So Hus, let's speak about Iran. And before we'll speak about the conflict, because we are recording this during the ongoing conflict, even though it was ceasefire today or sort of ceasefire, let's explain one fundamental question. And that's why Iran can't have nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, there are three reasons or three categories of reasons, let's say, why an Iranian nuclear weapon is undesirable, but also a development that would be a risk to international stability. Number one is clearly legal. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which prohibits states that do not have nuclear weapons from acquiring them, and from other states who do have them to pass that knowledge and know-how to countries that don't have them so that they can develop their own bomb. So as a signatory to the NPT, which Iran is, it is obligated to not become a nuclear weapons state. Now, the NPT allows for countries to become nuclear powers at the level of energy, not weaponization, to use nuclear power for generating electricity, especially. And that, many countries have nuclear power plants that is the backbone of their energy. So that's one category why Iran, as a signatory of NPT, should not have nuclear weapons. The second category, which people are more familiar with because it's in the news a lot more, is because of the threat posed to regional stability. If Iran were to get its hands on nuclear weapons, that would then force Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons to be able to properly deter itself from a regional rival, right? And then that would cascade. Maybe Egypt would then need to have a nuclear weapon. So a proliferation risks of a new nuclear power in the region could set in motion security dilemmas for other countries in the region. And then before you know it, you're ended up with even more nuclear weapons states. And that obviously risks the outbreak of nuclear war. And it also allows countries that have nuclear weapons to dominate and bully countries that do not. So there is a risk of regional instability at that level. And that's the kind of language that international diplomats use about the threat of Iran getting its hands on nuclear weapons. The last category of reasons is ideological, and it's about the regime type in power in Iran. And those reasons go as following. Countries that are authoritarian, that have regimes that make open threats to other countries, that have no respect for their own citizens' rights, and are not afraid of getting hit back or risking their sovereignty, should not be entrusted with nuclear weapons. Iran is ruled by an authoritarian theocracy, and it has made open threats about the obliteration of the state of Israel. And so a regime like that with nuclear weapons, the argument goes, would be a direct threat to its enemies, and it would perhaps not hesitate to use it, or to use it as a way to keep hostage certain policy points and to bend the world toward its will, especially in the Middle East. And that argument is something that this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu makes a lot, that American presidents and policymakers have made over and over again. And within kind of international relations academic circles, there's a kind of from a constructivist IR theory school of thought, one could see that, there's a difference between the United Kingdom, France, Italy having nuclear weapons, because the regimes in those places are not threatening. They're democracies. That's why the United States is not out to get, the UK to give up its nuclear power, right? It's not a threatening. It's a kind of government that is democratic and arrives at decisions about its nuclear posture in an open and transparent way. It does not want to obliterate other countries. It's defensive in nature. And so that last category of reasons has to do with regime type. And the type of regime that Iran has, observers who are worried about the Islamic Republic believe would use nuclear weapons in a way that could really trigger nuclear war.
What was the most significant during the first Trump administration regarding Iran?
The first Trump administration was hell-bent on canceling the Obama administration's policy on Iran. Trump campaigned on withdrawing out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Barack Obama spearheaded with the permanent 5 countries of the Security Council, plus Germany, the P5+1 so-called. That 2015 nuclear deal basically was an international landmark arms control agreement that committed Iran to significantly lowering its stockpiles of enriched uranium and to not enrich uranium past 3.67%. Just to give a context, you need 90% for bomb grade. So to 3.67% was at a level that's very compatible with nuclear power generation for electricity grids. And so that landmark agreement was one that Trump, as a candidate, believed was a bad deal, that the United States released all the sanctions on Iran, gave them all the money, and they still got to keep their nuclear program, right? And that, that Barack Obama was suckered into a bad deal, and the Europeans were suckered into a bad deal, et cetera. And obviously he was going to, when he became president, he's going to withdraw. It's very clear that that position was not really based on a studied perspective on proliferation, arms control. And it was really totally geared politically to make sure he has a substantive policy position that was very much opposite of what the previous administration had done. And so he comes into office, and by 2018, he withdraws out of the JCPOA. The Iranians are appalled. The Europeans are appalled because this was a multilateral nuclear agreement. And then he announces a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which was to ramp up sanctions even far beyond what they were before the nuclear deal on Iran, and to cut off Iran out of all global financial networks once again. And the architect of the maximum pressure policy were, at that point in the first administration, remnants of a kind of a hawkish Republican foreign policy establishment, people like John Bolton from the Bush administration, who was his national security advisor for a brief period of time before he was let go. And then Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, his second Secretary of State, who had a very hawkish line on Iran and ultimately was in favor of regime change in Tehran. Subsequently, Trump parted ways with all of those policymakers in the interregnum between his first term and second term when Biden was in office. And he broke up with those people not because of their policy views necessarily, but because they didn't support him strongly enough after January 6th events. And so that cadre of decision makers, or policymakers, I should say, are no longer around him and dictating Iran policy. One other significant event that happened in his first term was in January of 2020, when he ordered the assassination of most senior military commander of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was the architect of Iran's expansion after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 into the Shia Middle East, Arab Middle East, and then all the way of nurturing and backing the Bashar al-Assad regime and beefing up Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So to the extent that Iran established some sort of military hegemony from 2003 all the way up to the nuclear deal in 2015, it was all at the direction of Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was killed in Iraq in January of 2020, and that completely sent shockwaves through the Iranian regime's top decision makers. They didn't see it coming. No one thought that Trump would do this, and it looked like Trump didn't even know what he had exactly ordered. It was something that had been presented to him as a threat, and then, as Trump does, retrospectively try to justify it, that he was a terrorist and he was planning a major attack against the United States, etc. And that really, I think, summed up the major flashpoints in the first term of the Trump administration. The Iranians pretty much went in a defensive posture after that and decided to, draw a hard bargain with the Biden administration. The Biden administration kind of tested that early on to see if there was a possibility of going back to the JCPOA, but they didn't move on that fast enough. And I should say President Biden himself was always a kind of an outlier. He was not someone who was really massively supportive of the nuclear deal. He was an Iran hawk as a senator in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, especially when he was a chairman of it. Very pro-Israel. That was his kind of posture generally when it came to Middle East politics. And because he moved so slowly, the governments in Tehran changed. So the kind of the pragmatist-minded government of Rouhani got switched, and Ibrahim Raisi, a hardliner, became president in Tehran, and they adopted a very uncompromising posture toward the United States. So nothing really happened after the coming to power, the presidency of Ibrahim Raisi. And then we basically, during the Biden administration, you move up all the way up to October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel that then unleashed the most sophisticated, full-scale, full-spectrum Israeli intelligence and military operations that ended up decimating Iranian proxies in Syria, in southern Lebanon, and the most brazen attacks of which, I mean, a lot of this has been in the news, of assassinating the head of political wing of Hamas in Tehran in a Revolutionary Guards compound in 2024. Then assassinating Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, all but eliminating the Hezbollah threat in southern Lebanon. And then, lobbying and directly attacking Iranian airspace defenses. This is late in Biden administration in November and December. And then Iran also, for the first time, lobbying missiles at Israel. And that's the kind of the precarious or the new picture in the Middle East that Donald Trump inherited once he came into office in January. And the question was always, what would happen? Would Trump basically adopt a similar uncompromising approach, or was he actually going to this time go for a different deal? And he comes into office basically saying he wants a new deal. He thinks it's very possible. He wants to meet with Iranians and sends a few letters to the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader, writes back, and the back channel communications start in Oman as an interlocutor. And, Trump gives a period of 60 days of arriving at a deal. And that was really a backdrop to the latest all-out war between Israel and Iran. And I can go further into that conflict if you like.
Definitely. And I would like to ask you, because this is now a very interesting situation, because we are recording just a few hours after ceasefire was supposed to be in place between Iran and Israel. So I see there are 3 points I would like to comment when you will develop your answer. The first one is how and why Donald Trump agreed to support Israeli attacks on Iran, because we know that Iran retaliated, but those rockets and missiles, some of them they were caught by American or sort of international forces, we can say. We don't know, because it's the situation is blurry. We don't have specific information. The second point is Donald Trump decided to drop those mother of all bombs on Iranian main nuclear sites. Again, we can't confirm everything because we don't have like the hardcore facts. We're still working with information that are either officially released, or some of them they are leaking from the videos on social networks. And the last question or last point, ceasefire between Iran and Israel. This is not an easy task. You can't just announce this via social network. This needs like deep thinking, maybe to sign some agreements, maybe to guarantee something. And Trump just announced, we're going to have ceasefire and it will be like that or that. Was this real politics or it's more PR?
Yeah. All right, let me go back to why this attack took place now, which I think is the most important question of once the dust settles, of why did Netanyahu decide to attack at the time that he did? And you're absolutely right. We should, asterisk everything. We don't have all the information. All the intelligence about this is going to take some time to get declassified and come out. And so the full picture won't emerge for some time. But based on the reporting that's out there, it's very clear that, 2 weeks prior to the Israel attack on Iran, Trump had basically decided that the talks are not going anywhere, and that the United States and Israel begin to coordinate Israel's initial attacks, that the United States was aware that Israel was beginning to position itself to attack, and that the Israelis brought this up, and the administration greenlighted it ultimately in the last just before the attacks took place. And I think, I was asked in January of 2025 where I would put the probability of attack by Israel on Iran's military installations and perhaps nuclear facilities as well. And this was in a public forum, and I put it at 85%, which elicited an audible gasp from everyone, thinking that Trump says he's doesn't want another war. He's one of the things that about him that stand out. He's anti-war. He doesn't want to go start a new war in the Middle East. How could you say this? And my argument was very simple. Benjamin Netanyahu has worked his entire career to get to this moment where Iran's proxies that threatened the state of Israel with second wave attacks if Israel were to attack Iran were eliminated. So they're no longer a threat. Israel doesn't have to worry about attacks from the north from Hezbollah. It doesn't have to worry about the Hamas lobbing rockets. So all those the little impediments in between that kept Israel cautious because it doesn't want to lose civilians in large numbers have now been removed. Israel had also penetrated Iranian airspace and completely obliterated Iranian air defenses. So you have open skies, right? And Netanyahu has a president whom he all but openly campaigned for in this last election and ensured he would get massive campaign contributions from Israel hawks in the Republican administration, most notably the Adelson family, which is a very pro-Israel posture. And so this was the moment for Bibi to go and attack and have the backing of the President of the United States. And in fact, American air support as well. So the fact that, it was going to happen was not a question in my mind. It was a question of when. And the when of it is, clearly came at a point where the Iranians, I think, misplayed a poor hand that they had. They pretty much offered based on the reporting again, to the Trump administration, a modified version of the Obama deal from 2015. That's not good enough for Donald Trump. He doesn't want just marginally better than the JCPOA deal in 2015. He wants something he can boast about, says, I neutralized this threat, right? And understandably, the Iranians couldn't give that because they can't do it and, hold a straight face after he's assassinated their top general, after nuclear scientists have been assassinated routinely, and after Israel has penetrated their air defenses and assassinated and humiliated them by killing the Hamas leader in a Revolutionary Guards compound. So they cannot just say, yeah, we gave up our nuclear program and Donald Trump go and, campaign on it. So they were in a very tough position. And I think Netanyahu read that moment really well, that these talks are not going to get to a place where the Iranians can offer something Trump likes. Trump is getting frustrated. So we're going to use this window and say, we're going to attack. One key event that I think triggered the Israeli attack was a vote at the International Atomic Energy Agency meeting, in which the report by Rafael Grossi, the the Director General of the IAEA, noted that Iran was in violation of some of its obligations under the safeguards agreements of the NPT and with IAEA. And that was enough for Netanyahu to sort of say they are rushing to enrich, and it had to do with highly enriched uranium, that they're getting very close to developing a bomb. They might have enough material for 6 to 9 bombs already. That's what Netanyahu said in his public address, justifying the initial attacks. And so he goes in, and we then later on find out that Donald Trump had known about it, had green-lighted it, but also played, a kind of a deceptive tactic on the Iranians, thinking that another round of talks was coming. They were supposed to meet January 15th, which was a Sunday, in Oman, in Doha, rather, it was in Oman, in Muscat, to have a 6th round of talks between Iranian negotiators and Stephen Witkoff, Trump's envoy. And on Friday, the attack took place. So the Iranians were kind of caught off guard, and the Israelis went and bombed and killed a bunch of leadership. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, head of Iran's aerospace defense, the head of Iran's IRGC intelligence unit, and senior advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. And so war broke out. At that moment, Israel surprised the Iranians. Iran looked very much on the back foot, and daily attacks were taking place. Donald Trump watches this and says, I want in on the action and get some credit for this. Again, timeline is important. So on Sunday, on Friday, the attacks happen. On Saturday, it's the big military parade that Trump has in Washington, D.C. that turns out to be a humiliating event for him because it was so meagerly attended. The parade looked so out of sync with, what the United States usually does. He looked like an angry dictator at this parade, presiding over these kind of haphazard group of soldiers walking not in unison, the way he probably wanted it, the way, Kim Jong-un presides over a military parade, or the Chinese leaders, preside over their impressive military kind of marching with everyone, looking so well practiced. It was opposite of all that. And on top of that, the headline of that Saturday was the No Kings marches all across the country against him, which had a lot greater numbers attending them. And so he was pretty bruised. He watches what's happening in Israeli successes in Iran, and he immediately rushes in to support Israel and say, we knew all about it. This is great. Iran's complete surrender to the supreme leader. Total surrender, or we're going to come down even harder on you. We know where you're hiding, but we're not going to kill you yet. All this kind of bombastic tweets on social media. And so that goes on, and I think gives Netanyahu a lot of runway to carry out a lot of material strikes. Iran starts to hit back, and then obviously it culminates on June 22nd. The U.S. military dispatches its B-2 bombers, dropping the massive ordnance penetrators, or the bunker buster bombs, the MOP, or mother of all bombs, 14 of them on 3 key sensitive nuclear sites in Iran. We don't know what damage they did, as you noted. The damage assessment is something that's going to take some time to be verified. There are worrying signs that Iranians, had a convoy of trucks outside of Fordow, the most advanced underground nuclear facility that may have removed its highly enriched uranium well ahead of the Israeli attacks. The American attacks. We don't know, but after those attacks, basically Trump celebrates, but then immediately rushes to announce a ceasefire, seemingly, and this is remarkable. I mean, I think students of international politics have never read anything like it in the history books. He basically starts to conduct diplomacy on Truth Social, imposing red lines on Israel and Iran. There were Qatari mediators that were dispatched to achieve some sort of understanding between the Iranians and the Israelis for a ceasefire. But Trump jumps in and says, we've agreed to a ceasefire. This is when Iranians are going to stop. This is where the Israelis are going to stop. And I hope they stop. And then he starts writing a bunch of very effusive tweets or truth social posts, about how Iran could be the most prosperous, how Iran and Israel could be so prosperous and live in harmony, etc. As if, the last 2 weeks did not happen and the enmities have not hardened, etc. I think what it shows is that you have a leader who is first and foremost concerned about his optics, that he's in charge, that he is dictating the terms of a conflict, regardless of the details and how far apart the other parties in a conflict are. And make no mistake about it, Israel and Iran are at opposite ends. There's no rapprochement. The possibility of a nuclear deal is probably further away than it ever was. We don't know where the fissile material is. There's a lot of unknowns in this picture that it's going to probably sow a lot more instability. But one thing that's very certain, I think this ceasefire is a slap in the face of Benjamin Netanyahu, who wanted very much for this to continue. He had the Iranians on the back foot. They were not really inflicting major damage on Israeli society or military capabilities. Israel was doing a lot more, and they had hoped that the United States would actually support them in, getting the regime to a place where it would collapse. Maybe not regime change, but get it to a place of paralysis, where it is completely shambolic and some sort of new leadership would emerge. And clearly, Trump pulled the plug last minute on that. So Netanyahu, I'm sure, is not happy about this.
Hus, we have gone through many countries, many interesting ideas, and I'm very thankful for your time and that you shared your thoughts based on experience, based on years of research with us. So thank you again for being on Our Thinker. I wish you all the luck in your publications, research, and also in your podcasting, because we always appreciate that information from behind the scenes regarding the academics and scholars. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for these excellent sets of questions and the great structure you brought to these varying conversations from continent to continent, country to country. It always, I think, takes a good conversation partner and a questioner to be able to get words intelligently out. So I owe you to that and to your great program. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. Thank you again.